April 28th, 1945. The lifeless bodies of two figures hang upside down from the steel girders of a gas station in Milan's Piazzale, Loreto. The crowd below seethes with 20 years of suppressed rage, spitting and hurling objects at the corpses swaying in the morning light. One belonged to the man who had once commanded the loyalty of millions, the other to the woman who had chosen to share his final, terrifying journey into the darkness. This is the story of those last desperate hours, of a dictator's final gambit for survival, and of the brutal justice that awaited him and his companion in the mountains of northern Italy. By the spring of 1945, Benito Mussolini's Italian Social Republic, the puppet state he governed under German protection in northern Italy, was disintegrating. The man who had once stood on balconies addressing hundreds of thousands of adoring followers now found himself trapped in a shrinking territory, his authority challenged by advancing Allied forces and a growing network of Italian partisans. The transformation had been swift and merciless. Just 2 years earlier, Mussolini had been deposed by his own Grand Council and arrested on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel III. His dramatic rescue by German paratroopers in September 1943 had given him a second chance at power, but this reprieve came at a devastating cost. The Italian Social Republic, established in the north with its capital in Salo, was nothing more than a German-controlled territory. Mussolini, once the proud architect of fascism, had become a shadow of his former self, dependent on Nazi support and increasingly isolated from the Italian people. The partisan resistance had grown stronger with each passing month. These fighters, drawn from all walks of Italian society, had transformed the northern mountains and cities into a battlefield. They struck at German supply lines, assassinated fascist officials, and gradually liberated entire regions from Mussolini's control. The Duce, as he was still called by his dwindling supporters, found himself presiding over a regime that existed more on paper than in reality. The resistance movement had evolved into a sophisticated network of coordinated cells, each specializing in different aspects of the underground war. Communist partisans operated alongside Catholic Action members, monarchist loyalists fought beside Republican idealists, and former army officers commanded units made up of deserters and draft evaders. This unlikely coalition was united by a single goal: the complete elimination of fascist rule from Italian soil. The human cost of this resistance was staggering. Entire villages were destroyed in retaliation for partisan activities. Innocent civilians were executed as suspected collaborators. The German SS and their Italian fascist allies implemented increasingly brutal policies designed to terrorize the population into submission. Yet with each atrocity, the resistance grew stronger, fed by the desire for vengeance and the hope of liberation. Clara Petacci, the woman who had become Mussolini's companion and confidant, witnessed this decline firsthand. Nearly 30 years younger than the dictator, she had been by his side through the darkest period of his rule. Their relationship had begun in the 1930s, when she was a young woman from a middle-class Roman family. Despite being married to another man, she had become devoted to Mussolini, sharing not only his bed but also his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain power. Petacci's family had prospered under her protection, gaining wealth and influence through their connection to the dictator. Her father had received lucrative government contracts, her brother had been appointed to prestigious medical positions, and her husband had advanced in the diplomatic corps. But by 1945, these advantages had become liabilities as the fascist state crumbled around them. The couple's relationship had deepened during the war years, as Mussolini found himself increasingly isolated from his old political allies. Petacci provided not just physical comfort, but also emotional support during the dictator's darkest moments. She listened to his paranoid rants about traitors and conspirators, shared his grandiose fantasies about future victories, and remained loyal even as his closest advisors began to distance themselves from the failing regime. As Allied forces pushed northward through Italy in early 1945, the situation became increasingly hopeless. German troops were retreating, and the partisan activity intensified. Cities that had once been strongholds of fascist power were falling one by one. Milan, Turin, and Genoa were all under threat. The industrial north, which had been the backbone of Mussolini's war effort, was slipping away. The economic situation was catastrophic. The war had drained Italy's resources, bombing had destroyed much of the country's infrastructure, and the German occupation had stripped away anything of value. Workers in the northern factories were organizing strikes and sabotage operations. Food shortages were widespread, and the black market had become the primary source of basic necessities for most civilians. The psychological toll on Mussolini was evident to those around him. Reports from his inner circle described a man who had aged dramatically, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a tired, increasingly paranoid leader. He spoke of grand plans for a final stand, of negotiations with the Allies, of escape routes to Switzerland or Spain. But these were the desperate fantasies of a man who had lost touch with reality. His daily routine had become a series of increasingly meaningless rituals. He continued to review reports from commanders who controlled no real territory, issued orders to units that barely existed, and planned military operations with resources that were no longer available. The gap between his perception of the situation and the reality on the ground had become unbridgeable. By mid-April, even Mussolini's most loyal supporters began to understand that the end was near. The German forces that had propped up his regime were in full retreat, and the partisans were coordinating their attacks with increasing effectiveness. The noose was tightening around the fascist leadership, and soon, there would be nowhere left to run. But the dictator's final act was yet to come, and the events that would unfold in the last week of April would shock even those who had witnessed the brutality of the war years. The man who had once promised to restore the glory of ancient Rome was about to face the ultimate test of his own mortality. The atmosphere in Milan during the third week of April 1945 was electric with anticipation and dread. Partisan forces had coordinated a general insurrection that began on April 25th, and the city was rapidly falling under their control. Government buildings were occupied, fascist officials were being arrested or had fled, and the symbols of 20 years of fascist rule were being torn down by jubilant crowds. The insurrection had been carefully planned for months. Partisan commanders had infiltrated key installations, recruited sympathizers within the police force, and stockpiled weapons in safe houses throughout the city. When the signal was given, the uprising unfolded with remarkable coordination. Telephone exchanges were seized, radio stations were occupied, and barricades appeared on major streets with startling speed. The remaining fascist forces in Milan were outnumbered and demoralized. Many had already begun to desert their posts, recognizing that the war was lost and hoping to avoid the fate that awaited those who remained loyal to the regime. The few who attempted to resist were quickly overwhelmed by the combined forces of the partisans and the civilian population, who had joined the uprising with enthusiasm. For Mussolini, who had established his headquarters in the Palazzo Monforte, the situation had become untenable. The man who had once proclaimed that fascism would last 1,000 years now found himself trapped in a city that was rejecting everything he represented. His security forces were melting away, and loyal supporters were either dead, captured, or had abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. The palazzo itself had become a fortress under siege. Sandbags were piled at the windows. Machine gun nests were established at strategic points, and the remaining guards had been ordered to fight to the death. But these defensive measures could not disguise the fact that the regime was collapsing around its leader. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, and the smell of smoke from burning government buildings drifted through the air. Mussolini's behavior during these final days in Milan was erratic and increasingly detached from reality. He alternated between moments of grandiose planning and periods of deep despair. He spoke of mobilizing reserves that no longer existed, of counterattacks that could not be mounted, and of negotiations with enemies who had no interest in talking. His staff, reduced to a handful of die-hard loyalists, watched helplessly as their leader spiraled into delusion. The decision to flee came on April 25th, as the sound of partisan gunfire grew closer to the palazzo. Mussolini, accompanied by a small group of die-hard fascists and German SS officers, abandoned Milan in a convoy of vehicles. Their destination was uncertain. Some spoke of reaching the Valtellina, a mountainous region near the Swiss border where they might make a final stand. Others hoped to cross into Switzerland or even reach Germany, where they might find refuge. The convoy that assembled in the courtyard of the palazzo was a sorry sight compared to the magnificent processions that had once carried Mussolini through the streets of Rome. The vehicles were a mixture of civilian cars, military trucks, and armored cars, hastily loaded with whatever valuables and documents could be salvaged from the collapsing regime. The passengers were a motley collection of fascist officials, their families, German officers, and hangers-on who had nowhere else to go. Clara Petacci made the fateful decision to join this desperate exodus. Despite pleas from her family to distance herself from the doomed dictator, she chose to remain at his side. Her decision was motivated by a complex mixture of love, loyalty, and perhaps a recognition that her fate was already sealed by her association with the regime. Her brother Marcello, a doctor who had served as one of Mussolini's personal physicians, was also part of the fleeing group. The bonds that had sustained their relationship through the darkest years of the war would now lead them toward a shared doom. The departure from Milan was conducted under cover of darkness, with the convoy taking a circuitous route through the city's northern suburbs to avoid partisan checkpoints. The streets were largely deserted, but the sound of distant gunfire and the glow of fires reminded the fleeing fascists that they were leaving behind a city in revolution. For many of them, this was the last time they would see the urban landscape that had been the center of their power. The convoy's journey through the northern Italian countryside was fraught with danger. Partisan checkpoints had been established along most major routes, and the fleeing fascists were forced to take increasingly desperate detours through mountain roads. The group was constantly alert for ambushes, and the tension within the vehicles was palpable. Every distant sound could be enemy gunfire. Every roadblock could be their final trap. As they traveled, Mussolini's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Those who witnessed his final days described a man who alternated between moments of desperate bravado and periods of deep despair. He spoke of his legacy, of the great works he had accomplished, and of the ingratitude of the Italian people. But there were also moments when the reality of his situation seemed to penetrate his self-deception, and he would fall into brooding silences that lasted for hours. The physical deterioration of the dictator was also becoming apparent. The stress of the previous weeks had taken a visible toll, and he appeared much older than his 61 years. His famous jaw, once thrust forward in defiant poses, now seemed to sag with exhaustion. His eyes, which had once commanded attention from massive crowds, now darted nervously at every unexpected sound. The convoy's route took them through Como, where they hoped to link up with German forces that were still fighting a rearguard action. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. German units were surrendering or retreating across the border, and the partisan network was proving more effective than anyone had anticipated. Roads that had been clear in the morning were blocked by afternoon, and safe houses that had been reliable were suddenly compromised. Communication with the outside world had become almost impossible. Radio transmissions were intercepted by partisan listeners, telephone lines had been cut, and courier services had broken down. The fleeing fascists found themselves isolated in a hostile landscape, dependent on outdated information and increasingly desperate improvisation. On April 27th, the convoy reached the village of Dongo, on the western shore of Lake Como. Here they encountered a German anti-aircraft unit that was part of the general retreat northward. The German commander, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, was negotiating with local partisan leaders for safe passage for his men. This negotiation would prove to be the final trap for Mussolini and his companions. The events at Dongo would unfold with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy, as the hunters closed in on their prey, and the last chapter of fascist Italy prepared to reach its violent conclusion. The man who had once commanded armies was now reduced to a fugitive, dependent on the protection of foreign soldiers and the mercy of his enemies. The German convoy that Mussolini and his companions had joined consisted of approximately 50 vehicles, carrying retreating Wehrmacht and SS personnel. The column had been stopped at a partisan checkpoint in Dongo, where members of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade had taken control of the road. What followed was a tense negotiation that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The checkpoint itself was a hastily constructed barrier of fallen trees, sandbags, and commandeered vehicles that blocked the narrow road running along the shore of Lake Como. The partisans had chosen their position carefully. The lake on one side and steep mountains on the other made any attempt to bypass the checkpoint impossible. The German column was effectively trapped, forced to negotiate or fight their way through. The partisan leader conducting the negotiations was Pierluigi Bellini della Stelle, a former naval officer who had joined the resistance after the armistice of 1943. A man of aristocratic bearing and military training, he had proven himself to be one of the most effective commanders in the region. He was accompanied by Urbano Lazzaro, a communist militant who had become one of the most feared partisan leaders in northern Italy. The contrast between the two men, one a former officer and gentleman, the other a working-class revolutionary, exemplified the diverse coalition that had united against fascism. The negotiations began with standard military courtesy, but both sides understood the stakes involved. The Germans wanted safe passage to the Swiss border, while the partisans were determined to prevent the escape of war criminals and fascist collaborators. Intelligence reports had suggested that high-ranking fascist officials might be attempting to escape through this route, and the partisan commanders were under orders to conduct thorough searches of all vehicles. The German commander, Colonel Hans Fallmeyer, was a professional soldier who had no love for the fascist regime he had been ordered to protect. His primary concern was the safety of his men, and he was prepared to cooperate with the partisans if it meant avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. The negotiations proceeded with surprising civility, given the circumstances and the bitter fighting that had characterized the war in northern Italy. The search of the convoy began systematically, with partisans examining documents, questioning passengers, and looking for anyone who might be traveling under false papers. The process was slow and methodical, but it was during this search that the partisans made their most significant discovery. Hidden among the German soldiers, wearing a Wehrmacht greatcoat and steel helmet, was a man whose face was unmistakably familiar to anyone who had lived through the fascist era. The recognition came from Giuseppe Negri, a partisan who had worked as a laborer before the war and had seen Mussolini during one of his public appearances in Milan. Despite the disguise and the physical deterioration that had marked the dictator's final months, Negri was certain of his identification. The discovery sent shockwaves through the partisan ranks, as they realized they had captured the man who had been responsible for so much suffering in their country. The confirmation of Mussolini's identity required careful verification, as the consequences of a mistake would be enormous. The partisan commanders conducted a thorough examination, comparing the prisoner's features with photographs and asking questions that only the real Mussolini would know. The dictator's attempts to maintain his disguise were futile. His distinctive jawline, his mannerisms, and his voice all betrayed his true identity. Clara Petacci's presence complicated the situation further. She had initially tried to remain hidden among the other passengers, but her devotion to Mussolini proved her undoing. When the partisans identified the former dictator, she immediately moved to his side, making her own identity obvious. Her emotional state was described by witnesses as alternating between defiance and terror, as she realized that her decision to remain loyal to Mussolini had sealed her fate. The discovery of such high-profile prisoners created immediate tactical and political problems for the partisan commanders. They possessed the most wanted man in Italy, but they lacked clear orders from their superiors about how to proceed. Radio communications with partisan headquarters were sporadic due to German jamming in the mountainous terrain, and the military situation was changing rapidly throughout northern Italy. The debate among the partisan leaders was intense and reflected the broader political divisions within the resistance movement. Bellini della Stella, representing the more moderate elements, argued for holding Mussolini as a prisoner until irregular Allied forces could take custody. This approach would ensure that the former dictator faced formal justice through proper legal channels, which might help legitimize the new Italian government. However, Lazzaro and the communist partisans demanded immediate revolutionary justice. They argued that Mussolini had forfeited any right to legal protection through his crimes against the Italian people. The massacres, the deportations, the economic exploitation, and the disastrous war had created a debt that could only be paid with the dictator's life. They feared that turning him over to the Allies might result in a show trial that would allow him to escape the ultimate penalty. The emotional weight of the moment was overwhelming for many of the partisans. These men had lost friends, family members, and comrades to fascist violence. They had lived in hiding, fought against overwhelming odds, and sacrificed everything for this moment. The idea of allowing Mussolini to escape the consequences of his actions through legal technicalities was unbearable to those who had suffered under his rule. The captives were initially held in the town hall of Dongo, while the partisan leadership continued their urgent consultations. The building, a modest municipal structure overlooking the lake, had been transformed into a makeshift prison. Guards were posted at all entrances, and the local population was kept at a distance to prevent any demonstrations that might complicate the situation. Mussolini, perhaps recognizing the gravity of his situation, attempted to negotiate with his captors. He offered information about hidden fascist assets, promised to reveal the locations of treasure hoards that had been accumulated during the war, and even suggested that he might be useful to the Allies in post-war negotiations with the Soviet Union. These desperate gambits revealed the depths of his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces that had brought him to this point. The former dictator's attempts at negotiation were met with contempt by his guards. The partisans had no interest in deals or compromises with the man they held responsible for Italy's suffering. They had seen too much death and destruction to be swayed by promises of cooperation or revelations of hidden wealth. For them, this was a moment of reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. As word of the capture spread through the partisan network, the pressure for immediate action intensified. Commanders from other units began arriving in Dongo, each bringing their own perspectives on how to handle the situation. The communist elements within the resistance were particularly adamant that Mussolini should face revolutionary justice rather than be turned over to the Allies. They argued that allowing him to be tried by an international tribunal would rob the Italian people of their rightful vengeance. The debate continued through the night of April 27th and into the early hours of April 28th. During this time, Mussolini and Petacci were moved to a safe house in the nearby village of Bonzanigo, where they spent what would be their final night alive. The isolation and uncertainty of their situation must have been overwhelming, as they waited for a decision that would determine whether they would live to see another day. The die was cast when Walter Audizio, a communist partisan commander operating under the nom de guerre Colonel Valerio, arrived in the area with specific orders from the National Liberation Committee. These orders were unambiguous. Mussolini was to be executed immediately, without trial, as an enemy of the Italian people. The long debate was over, and the final act of the drama was about to begin. The morning of April 28, 1945, dawned gray and overcast around Lake Como. Walter Audizio, accompanied by a small group of partisan fighters, arrived at the safe house in Bonzanigo, where Mussolini and Clara Petacci had spent their final night. The communist commander carried with him the authority of the National Liberation Committee and the burning desire for vengeance that had sustained the resistance throughout the darkest years of the war. The safe house was a modest peasant dwelling that stood in stark contrast to the palaces and grand residences where Mussolini had spent the previous 2 decades. The former dictator, who had once commanded armies and decided the fate of nations, now found himself in a simple rural cottage, guarded by farmers and factory workers who had taken up arms against his regime. When Audizio announced his intentions, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Clara Petacci, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the capture and imprisonment, now broke down completely. She threw herself at Audizio's feet, pleading for mercy, begging him to spare Mussolini's life. Her desperation was palpable, but it only served to reinforce the partisans' determination to carry out their mission. Mussolini himself seemed to have accepted his fate with a resignation that surprised his captors. The man who had spent his career as a master of theatrical gestures now appeared drained of all fight. He asked only that Clara be spared, arguing that she had committed no crimes against the Italian people. But Audizio was unmoved by these pleas. In his view, Petacci had chosen her fate when she decided to remain loyal to the dictator. The execution party consisted of Audizio and 4 other partisans. They escorted their prisoners from the safe house to a nearby villa, where a car was waiting to transport them to the execution site. The journey was conducted in almost complete silence, broken only by Petacci's occasional sobs and Mussolini's muttered words of resignation. The chosen location was in front of the Villa Belmonte, a country house that overlooked Lake Como. The setting was almost pastoral, a far cry from the bombastic architecture and stage spectacles that had characterized Mussolini's years in power. Here, surrounded by the natural beauty of the Italian lakes, the final act of the fascist drama would unfold. As the car stopped in front of the villa's gates, both prisoners seemed to understand that their time had come. Mussolini stepped out first, his movements slow and deliberate. Clara followed, her emotional collapse now complete, as she realized that her pleas had been futile. The partisans formed a semicircle around their captives, weapons at the ready. Audizio announced that he was carrying out the sentence of death pronounced by the Italian people against Benito Mussolini and his accomplices. The words were formal, almost ceremonial, but they carried the weight of years of suffering and resistance. This was not merely the elimination of a political enemy, it was the symbolic destruction of an entire system of oppression. What happened next was swift and brutal. The partisans opened fire with their submachine guns, and both Mussolini and Petacci fell to the ground. The man who had once proclaimed himself the heir to Caesar died in the dirt beside a country road, his dreams of imperial glory reduced to nothing more than a memory. The bodies were loaded into the back of a truck for the journey to Milan, but the Partisan commanders had already decided that death was not enough. They wanted to ensure that the Italian people could see with their own eyes that the dictator who had terrorized them for 2 decades was truly dead. The public display of the corpses would serve both as proof of their victory and as a warning to any who might seek to continue the fascist cause. The truck carrying the bodies made its way through the liberated territories of northern Italy, passing through villages and towns where crowds had gathered to witness the aftermath of Mussolini's execution. The sight of the corpses confirmed what many had hardly dared to hope, that the nightmare of fascist rule was finally over. The truck, carrying the bodies of Mussolini and Clara Petacci, wound its way through the mountain roads toward Milan, passing through communities that had been liberated just days earlier. Word of the execution had spread quickly through the partisan network, and crowds began to gather along the route. For many Italians, the sight of the lifeless dictator represented the first tangible proof that their long ordeal was finally coming to an end. The journey took on an almost ceremonial quality. As the vehicle passed through each village and town, people emerged from their homes to witness the spectacle, some crossing themselves, others shouting curses at the dead dictator. Children who had grown up knowing only fascist rule stared in wonder at the man who had once seemed all-powerful, but now lay motionless in the back of a truck. The partisan commanders understood the psychological importance of this public display. For 20 years, Mussolini had used spectacular public ceremonies to reinforce his authority and create an aura of invincibility. Now, that same theatrical instinct was being turned against him. The image of his corpse being transported like a piece of cargo through the Italian countryside was intended to destroy any remaining mystique surrounding the fascist leadership. As the truck approached Milan, the crowds grew larger and more animated. The city had been liberated on April 25th, and the population was still celebrating their freedom. The news that Mussolini himself had been captured and executed added an almost delirious quality to the celebrations. People danced in the streets, sang partisan songs, and prepared for what they sensed would be a historic moment. The decision to display the bodies publicly in Milan was not made lightly. The partisan leadership knew that such a spectacle would be controversial and might even be criticized by the Allied authorities. However, they also understood that the Italian people needed to see concrete evidence that the fascist era was over. Without this visual proof, rumors and legends might persist, potentially allowing the fascist cause to survive underground. The truck reached Milan in the early morning hours of April 29th, and the bodies were initially taken to the city morgue. However, the partisan commanders had already decided on a more dramatic display. They chose Piazzale Loreto, a square in the working-class section of the city that had particular symbolic significance. This was the same location where, in August 1944, fascist forces had publicly executed 15 partisans in retaliation for resistance activities. The symmetry was deliberate and powerful. The square that had witnessed one of the most brutal examples of fascist repression would now become the site of the regime's ultimate humiliation. The circle of violence that had begun with Mussolini's rise to power would finally be closed in the same place where innocent patriots had paid the ultimate price for opposing his rule. As dawn broke over Milan on April 29th, the final preparations were made for what would become one of the most infamous spectacles in modern European history. The bodies were loaded onto another truck for the short journey to Piazzale Loreto, where a crowd was already beginning to gather. The Italian people were about to witness the end of an era in the most visceral and undeniable way possible. The stage was set for a display of popular justice that would shock the world and ensure that the image of the fallen dictator would be seared into the collective memory of Europe. The man who had once commanded from balconies would now be displayed in death, subject to the judgment of the very people he had oppressed for so long. The scene at Piazzale Loreto on the morning of April 29, 1945, was unlike anything Milan had ever witnessed. By dawn, word had spread throughout the city that the bodies of Mussolini and his companions would be displayed publicly. Thousands of people began converging on the square, their emotions ranging from jubilation to curiosity to a deep need for closure after years of oppression. The partisan commanders had arranged for the bodies to be suspended from the metal framework of an Esso gas station that dominated one side of the square. The symbolism was crude but effective. The man who had once stood elevated above the masses, delivering speeches from ornate balconies, now hung upside down like a piece of meat in a butcher's shop. The transformation from dictator to corpse was complete and undeniable. Clara Petacci's body hung beside Mussolini's, a testament to her decision to remain loyal to the fascist cause until the very end. Her presence in death, as in life, complicated the narrative of justice and revenge. While few mourned Mussolini's passing, some observers found the treatment of his companion unnecessarily cruel. However, the partisan leadership made no distinction between the dictator and those who had chosen to support him. The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. People pressed forward to get a better view, some spitting at the corpses, others throwing stones and debris. The 20 years of suppressed anger and frustration found expression in this moment of collective catharsis. Mothers held up their children to see the man who had sent their fathers to die in distant wars. Veterans of the resistance pointed out the dictator's lifeless form to their comrades, hardly believing that their enemy was finally defeated. Photographers and journalists who had arrived in Milan with the advancing Allied forces documented the scene extensively. The images they captured would be transmitted around the world, providing visual proof that the fascist regime had met its end. For many international observers, the spectacle was disturbing in its raw display of popular justice. But for the Italian people, it represented the necessary conclusion to a long and bitter struggle. The display continued throughout the day, with the crowd growing larger as news spread. People traveled from surrounding communities to witness the spectacle, creating a pilgrimage of sorts to the site of the dictator's humiliation. Street vendors appeared, selling food and drinks to the crowds, creating an almost festival atmosphere around the gruesome display. As the hours passed, the bodies began to show signs of decomposition in the spring sun. The partisan guards maintained order as best they could, but the crowd's enthusiasm sometimes threatened to overwhelm their control. At one point, a woman managed to break through the cordon and struck Mussolini's corpse with her umbrella, an act that drew cheers from the surrounding crowd. The international reaction to the spectacle was mixed. While Allied commanders understood the symbolic importance of the display, some were uncomfortable with its primitive nature. The images of the hanging corpses would become some of the most controversial photographs of the war, raising questions about the boundaries between justice and revenge. Religious authorities also expressed concern about the treatment of the bodies. Cardinal Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster, the Archbishop of Milan, issued a statement calling for Christian burial for all the dead, regardless of their crimes. However, his words had little impact on the crowd, which remained focused on extracting every possible moment of satisfaction from the spectacle. As evening approached, the partisan commanders decided that the display had served its purpose. The bodies were finally taken down and transported to the city morgue, where they would remain until final disposition could be determined. The crowd slowly dispersed, many participants carrying with them the memory of a day that had provided closure to one of the darkest chapters in Italian history. The spectacle at Piazzale Loreto marked the definitive end of fascist rule in Italy. The man who had once seemed invincible had been reduced to a symbol of defeated tyranny, his corpse serving as a powerful reminder of the ultimate fate that awaits those who oppress their own people. The removal of the bodies from Piazzale Loreto marked the beginning of a complex and controversial process to determine their final disposition. The partisan commanders, having achieved their immediate goal of demonstrating Mussolini's defeat, now faced the practical problem of what to do with the remains. The decision would prove to be almost as contentious as the execution itself. Initially, the bodies were held at the Milan city morgue, while various authorities debated the appropriate course of action. The Allied military government, which was assuming control of liberated Italian territories, was uncomfortable with the public spectacle and wanted to avoid any further inflammatory displays. However, they also recognized that the bodies had become symbols in a larger political struggle and could not be disposed of without careful consideration. The American military authorities, under the command of General Mark Clark, ultimately took custody of the remains. Their primary concern was preventing the creation of martyr sites that might be used by neo-fascist groups to rally support. The solution they implemented was both practical and symbolic: a secret burial in an unmarked grave that would deny followers any permanent shrine to their fallen leader. The burial took place on April 30th, 1945, in the Musacco Cemetery in Milan. The ceremony was conducted in complete secrecy, with only a handful of American military personnel and Italian officials present. No religious service was performed, and the grave was left unmarked to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site. The location was classified information, known only to a small group of Allied officials,